I'm a photojournalist in a pretty big city in the Midwest. Several years ago, when I was fresh out of college, I spent the winter doing a personal project on the homeless community in the city. Several weeks into working on the story, I started spending a lot of time documenting a sizable homeless camp that was just under an interstate overpass. It was also near a train yard, which conveniently was just over a mile away from my apartment. I got to know a lot of the people who stayed there pretty well, and never really felt threatened, except for one particular time. Throughout my time there, I knew who did and did not mind their picture getting taken, and whoever didn't want me to snap pics of them, I pretty much just left them alone. There was this one guy, Jay, who was camped a little farther away from the main camp than the rest. I never really bothered him, and some of the other residents told me he was very mentally ill. Either that or he was hooked on meth. It was best to just leave him alone, needless to say. Okay, fine by me, I never really interacted with him. One day, I was staying after dark to photograph a church bringing food to the camp. Jay had shown up that evening to grab some food. I ignored him and concentrated on photographing the others. It was starting to get dark, and the church group was just packing up to leave. At that point though, I noticed Jay was still around and was shooting me these really nasty glares. He also seemed to be following me around the area while I worked, staring at me. Once everyone went back to camp, however, he was gone. A few hours later, I left to head back to my apartment. I was really tired, and one of the shortcuts back was to walk a little ways up the railroad tracks and cut through this path that wound through a tree line and came out just by my apartment building. I was about halfway up the tracks to the path, where there was a decent amount of light from a highway that ran parallel to the tracks, when I realized someone was following me. I turn around and sure enough, there's Jay. He was about 30 feet from me. I just about jumped out of my skin at the realization that this dude had been following me the entire time, and I hadn't noticed at all. Not really knowing what to do, I just blurted out, hey dude.
Hey, did you take my picture earlier?
No, I don't think so.
I'm pretty sure you took my picture.
I really don't think I did, man, unless you happen to be in the background.
Did you take my picture?
I didn't. I told you I didn't, dude.
Oh yeah? Well, let me see your camera then. You're full of shit.
I started to walk backwards as he advanced upon me. No offense, man, but I don't let other people touch my stuff.
So, you did take my picture?
No, I didn't. At this point, Jay started screaming and accusing me of taking his picture. He demanded I show him all my photos. I refused because no shit, I'm not gonna hand a $6,000 camera to a dude in a state of rage. After a few minutes, he went from yelling at me to some sort of psychotic fit. He started screaming this enraged babble and started closing the distance between us. I turned around to bolt, and Jay lunged after me. Lucky for me, Jay was not a very big dude. I'm about 6'1" and have a full contact karate background, so I instinctively popped him one and then bolted. He chased after me for a few moments, just shrieking out more garbled nonsense. Once I got to a light near the path though, I turned around to look, and he was just gone. Shaken but quite relieved, I quickly made my way back to my apartment. I opened the door and was safely inside, when literally the instant I'd closed it, Jay smashed into it like a truck. Luckily, the door was latched, but he nearly knocked the entire frame out. I hit the floor, dropping my camera to the ground, then scrambled up the stairs and into my apartment, all while Jay was screaming this crazy nonsense shit, punching and kicking at the door. I called the cops, they came, and Jay was nowhere to be found. I just told them I'd heard someone trying to break into the building forcefully. Naively, I figured it would just fuck up my project if the cops turned up at the camp where several people were active users. Turns out though, homeboy Jay was not just punching that door. There were marks where clearly some sort of edged tool was being used. I bet it was a railroad spike, because several other people at the camp would keep spikes with them for protection, and those tracks were just littered with them. Anyway, I didn't go back to that place for quite some time. I ran into one of the other people who had been staying there though, and told them what happened. Ends up, shortly after this incident, Jay skipped town. Not even a week later, the cops came by the camp with his mugshot. Turns out he was wanted for almost beating another homeless person to death in another city. Well, I guess that explains why he was so paranoid about his picture ever being taken. My bet is he hopped on a train and rolled the rails out. He's somewhere else farther south probably. Or honestly, hopefully he's dead, because I never want to meet that crazy motherfucker ever again. This happened in the mid-90s. I was about 5 years old when my family decided to go on a trip to Fiji over spring break. My parents, aunts, and uncles grew up there, so we weren't solely there as tourists. The first few days we stayed with relatives and got the local experience. It was honestly a lot of fun. It was mine and my older brother's first time there. There was a group of us waiting. Me, my brother, a handful of our cousins around the same age, and all of our parents. I was the youngest one. After visiting relatives, the adults decided to rent a beach house out for the remainder of the trip. We were all really excited about the view and being so close to the beach as well. The house was really big too. To this day, it's still the biggest and nicest house I've ever had the chance to stay in. Anyway, we swam, hiked, sat around a bonfire, did all the usual outdoorsy stuff. The first night was so much fun, it's deeply ingrained into my memory. The second night, however, the adults decided to go out for a few hours and leave the older kids to take care of us younger ones. They weren't going to be gone long. They said they would come back at 10 o'clock at the very latest. The house had a security system installed as well, so no one was really worried about anything happening. Plus, this was the 90s. Being the oldest of the kids at 17, my brother was left in charge. We had 3 cousins with us, 2 boys, 11 and 15 years old respectively, and 1 girl who was also 15. I was rooming with that female cousin. The boys were rooming together as well, while the adults had their own private rooms. As I said before, I was the youngest by a long shot. Anyway, us kids decided to go to the beach while the sun was still out, an hour or 2 max. We packed up our beach gear and took off. The house was still in view, and we didn't even stray too far away. Basically, we were still in the backyard. My female cousin Joanna also made sure to not let me out of her sight. In fact, she stayed with me and built sandcastles the entire time. We took a bunch of pictures on her disposable camera, some of which are still tacked onto her fridge all these years later. We're still really close, and I look after her young daughter all the time. The boys were out swimming and doing their thing, while Joanna, Eric, and I stayed behind and played on the beach together. Our plans for staying out only a couple of hours soon turned into 3. It was only as the water started to become a bit too aggressive that we decided to go back inside. Because my brother's a dumbass though, he forgot the key to the back door in his room, so we had to use the front door of the house. This required us to walk all the way around the gate down the dirt road out front. We packed up our shit and took off, all 5 of us. It was honestly really dark at this point. Joanna and I held hands the entire way. Eric was walking with us, while my brother brought up the rear, and my older cousin Dean took the lead in front. We kept quiet as we were walking back, all of us extremely tired from being out all day. Joanna and my brother exchanged a few words here and there, but I was so tired I had no idea what anyone was saying, and I didn't really care either. My only concern was getting home to sleep and playing my Game Boy. It was only as Dean slowed to a halt in front of us that I realized something was awry. There was a man seemingly walking toward us from the other side of this dirt road. I was very young at the time, but I remember this man's face very clearly. He was old, Caucasian, very tan, and adorned in typical male tourist attire. A tropical shirt, cargo shorts, sandals, a straw hat. His clothes were kind of straight out of a tropical getaway catalog. There were other houses in the area being rented out by people, so we all figured he must just be in a neighboring property, perhaps walking home or something. Even so, my brother cut in front of Joanna, Eric, and I, just in case. He slowed down at the same time the man did. The man introduced himself as Eddie and claimed he was lost, looking for directions to the house he was supposed to be staying in. The man was clearly under the influence of something, kind of glassy-eyed and wobbly, couldn't even stand still. There was a lot of swaying. For whatever reason, his eyes kept drifting over to Joanna. He would periodically look at her while my brother was giving him the directions. It was around this time that Joanna, who had been holding my hand, squeezed my tiny fingers inside her slightly bigger ones. I could tell this man was making her nervous. Even then, at 5 years old, I sensed there was something seriously wrong with the way this guy was looking at her. Eric, 11, who had been up until that point ignoring me the entire trip because he wanted to look cool in front of the older boys, grabbed my hand tight, and the three of us stood together shaking behind Dean and my brother. I couldn't really hear the words being exchanged. I just saw my brother gesturing as he was giving directions, pointing his arm back to the left, whatnot. This lasted about 5 minutes before we were on our way. My brother made sure to walk beside Eddie for a minute, all the way past our shaky wall. Then he waved by and we carried on to our house. The older kids exchanged looks with each other but didn't say anything. In fact, we didn't speak of Eddie at all when we arrived back. We entered the house, showered, and met in the kitchen for something to eat. My brother cooked for us and we sat around the table, talking about how fun the beach was, when we heard a sudden knock at the door. Expecting our parents to be returning home, we didn't really think that much of it. The older kids were too lazy to get up and answer it, but Dean eventually caved in. He went over to the door, and I, being a curious 5-year-old, went with him. There were windows and a peephole on the door, where Dean could have looked, but he didn't. We weren't expecting anyone else. He unlocked the door and opened it, his body language turning rigid immediately as he locked eyes with Eddie. Within seconds, Dean was on the defense. He glanced back, motioning for me to back away and grab my brother. I waited a couple of seconds before doing so, catching Eddie as he asked Dean if he could come inside and use the phone in the house. Apparently, the walk was too far away, and it was killing his legs, so he wanted to call a cab. This was before the age of everyone and their mother having a cell phone, so showing up on someone's doorstep asking to use their phone was not necessarily too out of the ordinary. I skittered off to the kitchen and motioned for my brother to follow me. I guess he saw the mildly anxious look in my eyes, so he immediately dropped his food onto his plate and went out the door. Like Dean, his body went rigid when he saw Eddie standing there. The three of them spoke at the door for quite a while. Eddie was begging to use the phone, while Dean and my brother insisted they would not let him inside. If he really wanted to use it, he should wait until the adults arrived home and ask them instead. By telling him this, though, they had accidentally let slip the fact that us kids were all home alone. They must have been going at it for at least 10 minutes. By this time, Joanna came out to see what was happening. I remember she rocked back when she saw Eddie at the door, breath catching in her chest. She glanced at me and nodded for me to join Eric in the kitchen. Usually, I wouldn't have listened, but that night I did. I went back to the kitchen and told Eric what was going on at the door. Even though he was older than me, he got scared way easier. Even to this day, he's still very jumpy when it comes to horror movies and that kind of thing. For this reason, he swallowed the dry lump in his throat and yanked me back when I took off to see what was going on. Sometime later, Joanna and Dean returned to the kitchen without my brother. I raced past them, poking my head around the corner, to see my brother had let Eddie inside the house, standing with him as he used the phone. It was attached to the wall in the hallway. My brother leaned against the wall and kept his attention firmly on Eddie as the man dialed the number for the cab company and called one to our address. This took about a minute, after which Eddie thanked my brother and waved bye to me on his way out. My brother kept the front door open after, standing there and watching for a solid 20 or so minutes until the cab arrived and drove Eddie away. Our parents came home 10 minutes later, a car full of groceries in the trunk. As per my brother's request, we decided not to tell our parents about Eddie. If they knew we let a stranger inside to use the phone, they would have blown their shit. Rightfully so, but still, we were kids and my brother tried to sort the situation out as best he could. Plus, Eddie didn't really do anything per se. There was just something about him that was odd. The rest of the night went by without a hitch. In fact, 2 nights went by without anything weird happening. By this point, we had all forgotten about Eddie. At least I had. Joanna, on the other hand, kept a huge kitchen knife under her pillow just in case. I had no idea at the time. On the fourth night at the house, the adults cracked open the barbecue outside, and we had a little cookout in the back. It was a really good time, actually. It was good food, cold drinks, a deadly game of Monopoly, and even a bit of storytelling from my inebriated uncle. My parents told me I could stay up late with everyone and everything, which I hadn't been allowed to do the entire time we were there thus far. Suffice to say, we were all having a very good night. The stars were out, the waves were crashing softly on the shore, and the mosquitoes were biting the fuck out of us. My mother went inside to grab some repellent, and didn't return until a couple of minutes later. She went straight to my father after, without the repellent, and whispered something in his ear, a strange look on her face. The others noticed, eventually asking what was going on. She said a strange man had arrived at the front door, knocking repeatedly. My father and my sober uncle, Joanna's father, went over to check out what all this fuss was about. They answered the door, and there was Eddie. When they asked what he wanted, he kept on saying, "My buddy Will said I could swing by. Can I talk to my little buddy?" Will was my brother's name. I remember thinking that was so weird, the fact he kept referring to my brother as his buddy. The adults found it very strange too, needless to say. My father asked why he wanted to talk with my brother. Eddie just kept saying Will was his buddy, and he really wanted to see him. He was very clearly on something as well. Eventually, Eddie said he needed to use the phone again, and Will had let him use it last time. It seemed the jig was up. My father glanced back at Will as he came up to see what was going on. He gave him the "boy you done fucked up" look. He knew better than to let strangers in the house. But that was the thing. Eddie had a way about him. He was odd, but in a way that was kind of disarming, like he didn't know whether you wanted to knock him out or help him out. They both told Eddie he couldn't use the phone, but they did give him directions to the nearest convenience store where he could ask them. Eddie tried to persuade them into letting him use our phone, but they firmly told him he had to leave, shutting the door in his face immediately. Sometime later, we all settled into bed. Joanna and I stayed up a bit later, and she read me a chapter out of the young adult novel she had been reading the entire trip. It was Flowers in the Attic, in case you're curious. Certainly not the most appropriate novel for a child of 5, but I had no idea what any of it meant anyway. In any case, I fell asleep easily. A few hours later, I woke up to the hushed sound of Joanna's voice. She shook me awake hurriedly and said we had to hide in the bathroom right now. The look in her eyes was wide and full of fear. Without her even telling me directly, I knew this must be about Eddie. She took me by the hand and we locked ourselves in the bathroom. I noticed she kept on touching the back pocket of her jeans, but I didn't know why. I later found out she had tucked the knife in there and felt for it every few seconds to make sure she still had it. We hid for about an hour until we heard the sound of the police arriving. I remember hearing their loud footsteps in the house and Joanna opening the door for them when they knocked on the bathroom to see where we were. I didn't know it back then, but apparently Eddie had snuck into the house while we were all sleeping. The boys' room was really warm that night, so the three of them had left the window open to get a breeze in. Apparently, Eddie had been waiting around the entire time and snuck in through the window and quietly climbed inside. Eric, the poor thing, was the first one to see him and scream bloody murder, waking up Dean and my brother. Eddie's eyes were completely bloodshot, twitching all over the place. Climbing in, he asked his buddy to help him find that sweet girl from the other night. He was referring to Joanna. Every screw in his head was loose. He began laughing, shouting and telling my brother how they could take turns on her, amongst other obscene things. It's like he couldn't decide whether he was horny or angry. According to my brother and everyone else who restrained and held Eddie down that night, there was something incredibly off about him, other than the fact he had just broken into our house. The way he was talking, he was so delusional, as if he was fully convinced Will was his best friend and Joanna was going to be his that night. It was really terrifying. To this day, my brother refuses to talk about it in detail. I think it has something to do with Eddie really truly believing they were like old buds who had promised to use Joanna like a rag doll and throw her away. This man was so fucking convinced. Apparently, their screaming woke the adults as well. My mother called the police, while my father and 2 uncles held Eddie down till the cops got there. Joanna's mother raced upstairs and woke her up, telling her to grab me and hide until further notice. We didn't know if Eddie had come alone either, but we were pretty convinced after a while. My mom checked if the other windows and doors were closed and locked. Then she took Eric upstairs and waited with him in the hallway, trying to calm him down while the cops arrived. Turns out Eddie had some mental problems. He had become obsessed with Joanna the moment he had seen her. She was exactly his type, young, of color, and unwilling. Oh, and we later found out Joanna wasn't the only girl he had harassed on this trip either. She was the only one whose house he snuck into in search of her though. Who knows what would have happened if he climbed in through our window that night instead of the boys. It was December, and Christmas was just around the corner. It was late around this time, around 3 a.m. or so, I believe. I was sick, so I was on a very strange sleep schedule. I was extremely bored as well, and none of my friends were online. I decided to venture into a little site called Omegle. I went on there quite often at that time, mainly to troll people. Tonight, though, I decided to have some actual conversations. Big mistake. I decided to talk to some people under the anime tag, because people on there seem mostly cool generally. Of course, there were always horny teenagers looking for a girlfriend no matter what tag you're on. I eventually found someone who wasn't a bot, and didn't immediately ask ASL. We'll call her Azula. Azula started by asking me what my favorite anime was, and I jokingly replied Fat Albert. I knew I didn't want to troll, but I just couldn't help myself. Well, apparently that was a good start. A healthy and fun conversation ensued after about anime. She seemed like a really fun person to talk to. Then she asked for my email. I gave her my spam email, knowing there was no real harm in giving that away. We continued our chat in a Google Plus hangout. She started to ask me to video chat, which I declined, telling her that I didn't even do that with my real-life friends. Still though, she kept on persisting, and I kept on telling her no. I was starting to think that she was actually some pedophile. I told her that I didn't feel comfortable revealing my face to anyone, and I really didn't want to voice chat. Then she told me she'd send a picture of her face if I sent her a picture of mine, so I let her send in hers first. I did a reverse image search on multiple sites to check if the photo was fake, but nothing came up anywhere, so I knew this was legit a young girl. Reluctantly, I took a picture of myself and sent it to her. I figured what harm could that do? She kept on persisting to video chat, but I kept telling her no. I then turned my computer off because I was tired and quite annoyed. I really didn't think that much about it. I was just planning on blocking her the next day. A day later, I hop on my computer and was just about to block her. As soon as I logged in, she messaged me immediately. At this point, I thought she must either be stalking my profile or had no life and was on her computer all day. I went ahead and talked to her a bit. She apologized for being pushy and explained that she really didn't have that many friends. She just wanted to get to know me better. I said that was fine. We talked about anime, video games, a pretty normal conversation for the most part. The next day, we talked again. She wanted to video chat. I told her I'd do a voice chat this time. Once we were in the voice call, she kept on insisting I turn my camera on though. She already had hers on, so I was sure she was not like some 40-year-old man or something. Still though, I didn't really feel comfortable doing that. She pulled out the reverse Uno card though. She wanted me to video chat to make sure I wasn't a 40-year-old pedo either. My voice was quite deep, so I understood. Reluctantly, I flipped my camera on. After that, everything seemed to be okay actually. I could tell there was something weird about her, but I figured it was just social awkwardness. After that, things were normal for a few weeks. One day though, she randomly told me she had a crush on me. I told her I don't do online relationships, and she got really depressed after that. She started telling me about how every guy she liked had turned her down, and she was really upset. I didn't know how to respond really. I felt bad because I knew how it felt to be rejected and how awkward it was to stay friends after. So I made one of the dumbest mistakes of my life. I said I actually did like her back. Nowadays, there's no way in hell I would have lied like that, but I was 14 at the time and I didn't really know what to do. Basically, I was in a fake, fabricated online relationship at this point. I didn't consider her my real girlfriend, and only one of my friends, who we'll call Eric, even knew about her existing. In fact, one day he was in a group chat with us, and that's when things started to get strange. In the group chat, we had a decent conversation, but it got weird after I left. Azula started asking Eric really personal questions about me. Eric gave her the runaround, telling her she should be asking me all of this stuff. She was asking questions like what my last name was, where I lived. Eric didn't tell me about this, but I did see in the group chat. I thought it was really strange she would do that, knowing I would see them when I got back. Anyway, at this point she was really insistent on knowing my last name. She would not stop asking no matter how many times I declined. I found out she was going on Facebook, searching every single person with the same first name as me. I couldn't believe it. She spent like a week trying to find me. I had never seen so much dedication. The red flags were popping up at this point. She eventually did manage to find my Facebook and sent me a friend request. I declined it because I was pissed she was invading my privacy. She then started messaging me on Google Hangouts, talking about my family members. She literally wrote down a list of all of them, asking how I knew them and how they were related to me. I started to get really scared at this point. I knew I had a stalker, but I didn't know how to handle it. I blocked her on everything and deleted everything on the net that had my real name to it. I officially went dark. Eventually though, she emailed me on another email of mine. I don't even know how she found it. I'd never given it to her, so honestly I have no clue. Perhaps it had been on my Facebook before I deleted it, but I don't think so. Anyway, she spammed that email with countless messages per day. I blocked her and the email stopped. I didn't hear from her for about a month. Then one day, I accidentally deleted a fairly important email, so I go in my trash to recover it. In my trash, there were thousands of emails from her. I nearly soiled myself in fear. In fact, the last email was from that very day. So, in morbid curiosity, I read through some of these emails. What I discovered was nothing short of terrifying. She told me she thought there must be something wrong with her. She enjoyed and got off on the pain and fear of others. She told me she knew exactly where I lived, and she was going to fly over and be there with me, forever. I was so scared at this point, I was honestly worried she was going to come kill me. I deleted that email account and went off the grid ever since. One summer when I was around 5 years old and my sister was around 8, we are both females by the way, I awoke to hear through our bedroom window my parents shouting loudly on the back patio. This was not a common occurrence, and when they did fight, it was not typically anywhere there was a chance of us hearing. This sort of thing did happen from time to time though, and though the situation was mildly unusual, we shrugged it off. We shut the window and went back to sleep. We promptly forgot about that whole ordeal. It wasn't until years later when we learned the truth about all that yelling. As a near adult, I overheard my mother explaining the situation to a family member in another room. Apparently, at some point in the night after my sister and I had went to bed that night, our parents had received an unusual phone call from someone using an electronic interpreter, the same type of technology a person who's deaf might use to make calls and communicate over the phone. Understandably, my parents were a little bit surprised. We didn't know anyone who would use this service to contact us. Either way, they accepted the call though. I'm not sure how the person on the other line introduced themselves, or if they even did at all, but they knew the full names of everyone in my family. Immediately, that was very creepy and alarming. The conversation soon escalated, as the person on the other end of this phone line specifically explained what our house looked like. They told my parents they were hiding in our backyard, which was large, dark, and full of all kinds of plants and trees, which made it very hard to clearly see. There were too many places to look. At this point, the tormentor made it clear they had intentions of entering our home and killing my sister and I. At this point, understandably, my parents were beginning to become frantic. Sure, there was a chance that nobody was out there and this was just some kind of cruel joke, but that notion was not worth the risk of believing. My dad asked if they really were where they said they were. If so, what were my parents doing at that moment? What were they wearing? Just like that, the person on the other end of the line explained exactly what my father was doing mid-action, exactly what they were both wearing, where certain items on our patio were placed, the expression on my mom's face as he said this, every detail. My dad, a rough guy with a heart of gold, charged into the night ready to kill any person he encountered. Neither of my parents had cell phones. I don't think they were even a thing at this time. My mom grabbed the phone which had been put down by my dad and called the cops. As brave and stupid as my dad was for venturing into the dark that night, he found nothing out there. When the cops arrived shortly thereafter, they found nothing either. The police were not able to trace the call because of the electronic interpreter, which they said was a fairly common device used by people trying to anonymously harass others over the phone. Nothing ever came of this incident, and as I said, I was not told about it until at least a decade after it happened. Was this the work of a former friend or enemy trying to play some kind of cruel joke? Was there an actual murderer in my backyard? I guess we'll never know.